Chapter 5, Empiricism Against the Renaissance. What has philosophy to do with measuring? It's the mathematicians you've got to trust. They are the surveyors of empty air, the way I can survey the field and tell you how long it is. L'Opere di Galileo Galilei, the works of Galileo Galilei. This chapter brings us back to the fundamental issue raised at the beginning of this work, the nature of man and his role in the universe. Venice's break with the Holy Alliance was not simply political, it was a realization by Sarpi and his associates that feudalism and backwardness could no longer be imposed by brute force and superstition. The Renaissance idea of the Commonwealth, Cusa's revolution in science, and the economic progress they both engendered, could no longer be contained either by Venice's purely geopolitical maneuvering, nor by the belief structures of the Middle Ages. These beliefs were, in fact, inevitably doomed. The work of Cusa, leading a century later into the discoveries of Johannes Kepler, annihilated the entire medieval Aristotelian philosophy. Sarpi knew that there was no saving the old mechanisms of social control. In order to preserve oligarchical rule, he formulated a threefold strategy. 1. Develop a new science of radical materialism, known as empiricism, and demand that all scientific investigation utilize this empirical method. 2. Use the discoveries of this new empirical science to falsely claim for himself and his associates the laurels for overturning the dictatorship of Aristotelianism. This is where the Galileo project fits in. 3. Utilizing sympathetic networks and individuals to spread this new empirical science from one corner of Europe to another, until it was hegemonic everywhere. Linda LaRouche has defined the empirical method of Sarpi as follows. First, the empiricist assumes that no experimentally verifiable knowledge exists outside the bounds of simple sense certainty. Secondly, therefore, every cause-effect relationship which cannot be located explicitly in a sense-observed agency is related to a domain of such forms of attributed bias in statistical behavior of observable events, or to some anonymous agency to which neither sense certainty nor cognitive reason provides access. Thirdly, the second element leaves available a niche for creating the illusion of the existence of purely magical spiritual powers, operating entirely outside the reach of access by sense certainty, but able to make arbitrary interventions, even capriciously, into the domain of sense certainty. Essentially what Sarpi did was to say, since scientific progress can no longer be stopped, I will determine the method of all scientific investigation. I will determine not merely what people think about the physical universe, but how they think, and I will ensure that individual human creativity and the method of lawful hypothesis is banned from all scientific investigation. In Sarpi's world, there is no hypothesis, there is no creativity, and there is no discovery. Only observation and calculation of linear data exists. The 21st century name for this is information theory. And in a world governed by this theory, no human identity is possible. Machines and computers may exist, but the ability to make actual discoveries of principle has been outlawed. If this seems too difficult to understand, think of the difference between Kepler and Galileo. Kepler sought to discover the principles behind astronomical phenomena. Galileo looked at the stars and wrote down his statistical observations. For Galileo and Sarpi, Kepler's universal principles simply do not exist, because they cannot be touched, heard, smelled or visibly seen. Sarpi and Ockham. In order to develop his new science, Sarpi went back to the writings of a 14th century Franciscan friar named William of Ockham. Today Ockham is mostly remembered from just one famous quote, which has come to be known as Ockham's razor.
Pluralitas non est ponenda sine necessitate.
Or, in English, entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily. Roughly, Ockham's meaning is that when confronted with a scientific problem, in which there are several possible solutions or areas of investigation, the answer lies with the simplest and most obvious. This reductionist method denies any role for human reason or hypothesis, and rejects any idea of universal principles. Ockham was also a fanatic materialist, claiming that all human knowledge is based solely on sense perception. Utilizing Ockham's approach, whatever shred of causality or human thought, which had existed previously in Aristotelianism, was eliminated entirely. Paolo Sarpi stated openly that Ockham was the greatest influence on his own scientific outlook. In a letter to the French Huguenot François Hodman on July 22, 1608, Sarpi says of Ockham,
Io l'ho stimato sopra tutti gli scolastici.
Which roughly translated is, I have esteemed him, Ockham, above all the schoolmen. Beginning in 1578, and continuing for many years, Sarpi began writing his Penseri, a series of works on mathematics, biology, philosophy and religion. Laudatory references to Ockham abound throughout the work. These writings were never published, but were widely circulated to Sarpi's friends in the Ridotti. Sarpi authored 3 sets of Penseri, the first on mathematics, philosophy, and physics, the second on medicine and morals, and the third on religion. In the Penseri Philosophici, Sarpi argues on the defects in man's nature which make religion and government necessary in order to control man's passions and baser animalistic impulses. This argument anticipates Descartes' later view of a linear mechanistic physical universe, combined with irrational human emotions. The Penseri Religioni contains a long attack on Aristotle and on Christian concepts of natural law. Sarpi states that it is impossible for man to know natural law or any universal principles due to the limits on human reasoning. In the famous Penseri number 146, Sarpi is most explicit in his empiricist method, as well as his extreme materialism. There is no reality whatsoever outside the world of sensory experience. The Penseri were not ivory tower speculations. The ideas set forth by Sarpi were immediately put into practice to develop a new experimental science and a new mathematics, based on his reductionist empiricist methodology. According to his 18th century biographer, who examined Sarpi's private papers at the Library of the Servi in Venice, Sarpi's papers included many works on geometry, mechanics, hydraulics, pneumatics, optics, astronomy, and acoustics. Sarpi's first major area of research was his 1582 to 1585 work on anatomy, a subject which he had earlier studied at Padua. Later, as Sarpi's ideas gained influence in various European university faculties, the earliest recruits were among the professors of medicine and mathematics, and it was in those fields that Sarpi's mechanistic method spread most quickly. Among the initial Venetian group which promoted Sarpi's new science were Giovanni Francesco Sagredo, Centorio, and Marc Antonio di Dominis. Di Dominis, who we have already met in the previous chapter, was a professor of mathematics at the University of Padua, where he conducted experiments on optics, physics, and mechanics. Sagredo, a leading Venetian aristocrat, was also a mathematician, and he was Sarpi's personal controller of Galileo. He actually invented the first modern version of a thermometer, which is usually attributed to Galileo. Centorio was the chair of theoretical medicine at the University of Padua. His belief in mechanics was so insane that for 30 years he not only weighed himself every day, but also weighed all the food and fluids he consumed as well as all the urine and feces he emitted. He was celebrated for his empirical methodology. He denied the essence of things, insisting on the fundamental mathematical and mechanical nature of things, which could only be discovered through sense perception. The assault on Aristotle. Aristotelianism had dominated Europe from the 11th through the early 15th centuries, including in the universities and the Catholic Church. It was never good. But the anti-cognitive, fixed, perfected universe of Aristotle was perfect for Venice's zero-growth caste system of the medieval centuries. During that period, Aristotle's views on cosmology, music, biology, and economics were accepted with almost the fervor of religious fundamentalism. After the revolution in science effected by Nicholas of Cusa, this became impossible. The question arises, what's the big deal? Don't Aristotle and Sarpi both base their ideology on sense perception? Yes, they do. But in Sarpi, you have this method in extremis. It's like the difference between a bodybuilder and a gym who says no pain. no gain, and the Marquis de Sade. The concept pain takes on a different meaning. With Sarpi, human reasoning ceases to exist. In 1604, the Sarpi cabal unleashed an open public war against Aristotelianism and the Aristotelian priesthood at the University of Padua. At the time, Padua was the premier center of Aristotelian scholarship in all of Europe, and had produced the two most renowned teachers of Aristotelian logic during that era, the professors Giacomo Zabarella, 1533 to 1589, and Cesare Cremonini, 1550 to 1631. The opening salvo of this attack was a series of lectures by Galileo Galilei, targeting Aristotle's cosmology, that is, the notion of the fixed stars, existing within a static, perfected universe. These lectures were given a sensational PR treatment by the Sarpi network, based on Galileo's alleged recent discovery of the new star, which, in fact, Galileo did not discover. This was no academic debate. It struck at the center of the Aristotelian establishment, and was nothing less than an attempt to overthrow the entirety of medieval scholasticism. Even still today, Giacomo Zabarella is considered the premier representative of 16th century Italian Aristotelianism. After 1564, he became both the chair in logic and the chair in natural philosophy at the University of Padua. Origin Aristotelian, Zabarella, nevertheless also insisted on the reality of causality, and said that it is the mind of the scientist which carries out the necessary proofs. He was opposed to using mathematical proofs as a way of arriving at truth. Cesare Cremonini, who succeeded to the chair of natural philosophy in 1591, was, more so than Zabarella, an avowed materialist, and like Pimpanesi before him, he denied the immortality of the soul. Nevertheless, he became Galileo's leading critic at the University of Padua. In 1604, Cremonini was the foremost opponent of Galileo's views on the new star, and he was quoted by a contemporary source at the time as saying, "The mathematicians adduce the expressed view that it is bad judgment to forsake the senses and go searching for reason, that is cause." In his 1632 The Dialogue Concerning Two Chief World Systems, Galileo ridicules Cremonini, portraying him as a buffoonish figure simplicio. This attack on the Aristotelian establishment was the premier task assigned to Galileo by Sarpi, although, today, many uninformed people somehow think that Galileo was a champion of Copernicanism. Galileo, in fact, was one of the last astronomers of the period to endorse heliocentrism, which he did not do until the publication of his 1632 Dialogue. From his arrival in Padua in 1592, up until that much later date, all of Galileo's efforts were concentrated on overthrowing Aristotelian scholasticism on behalf of Sarpi's new empiricism. Kepler. Sarpi's plan to monopolize the scientific discrediting of Aristotle took on a new urgency with the publication, in 1597, of Johannes Kepler's Mysterium Cosmographicum. Upon the completion of this work, Kepler had sent 4 copies of the book to Padua, one of which ended up in the hands of Galileo, who passed it on to Sarpi. Galileo subsequently wrote to Kepler, and several short notes passed between them. In September 1597, Kepler sent a longer letter to Galileo suggesting a collaboration between the two. Following this exchange of letters, Galileo cut off all communication with Kepler. Outside of Italy, the publication of the Mysterium had a powerful impact on the scientific community and led to Kepler's appointment as imperial mathematician to the German emperor in 1601. In Venice, it led to Sarpi's 1603 to 1604 unleashing of the Galileo project. Later, after the publication of Kepler's Astronomia Nova, New Astronomy, in 1609, Sarpi again responded, this time with the Venetian telescope demonstrations, and the accelerated campaign to sell Galileo as the premier authority on astronomy. For the layman it may seem difficult to comprehend the threat which Kepler's work posed to Sarpi's designs, but bear in mind, Kepler was a proclaimed self-conscious follower of the scientific method of Nicholas of Cusa. Not only was his methodology directly contrary to Sarpi's empiricism, it represented an axiomatically different view of the human mind, of human nature itself. For the empiricists, Man is only capable of taking in sensory data and adding, subtracting and manipulating that data in linear ways to arrive at what they call verifiable results. This also holds true for Sarpi's views on mathematics. Anyone who accepts that approach will ultimately be led to the unenviable conclusion that a supercomputer is, in fact, equal or superior to the human mind. For Ockham and Kepler, science begins where linear analysis breaks down, where the power of human hypothesis leads to the discovery, not of more sensory data, but to true discovery of the universal principles which underlie the ordering of the universe. Recently, a team of young scientists from the LaRouche Youth Movement has created a website which contains the most exhaustive examination of Kepler's work that has ever been done by anyone since Kepler's death. For those who wish to examine these matters in more depth, I encourage you to visit it. After the abortive Kepler-Galileo correspondence of 1597, the Venetians broke off all communication with Kepler for 13 years. During this period, they knew that they could not openly attack him due to his position and widespread prestige. Then, after Galileo's demonstration of the telescope and the publication of his Siderus Nuntius, another attempt was made to bring Kepler under Venetian control. In 1610, Galileo sent a long letter to Kepler, soliciting Kepler's endorsement. Kepler responded with the publication of Dissertatio cum Nuncio Siderio, which essentially challenged Galileo to adopt Kepler's scientific method. Following the publication of the Dissertatio, no further communication between Kepler and Galileo occurred. Having failed to co-opt or discredit Kepler, Sarpi next moved to destroy him. In 1618, Galileo publicly assailed Kepler's theory on the origin of comets. Kepler was right, and Galileo was wrong, and, following the publication of Kepler's Harmonices Mundi, Harmony of the Worlds, Galileo, in 1624, denounced Kepler as a heretic, a very serious charge, actually a not-so-veiled death threat. It was also during this period, in 1620, that Henry Wotton, the notorious British ally of Sarpi, traveled to Vienna, met with Kepler, and urged him to move to England. Kepler declined this offer to join the stable of Venetian agents in London. Galileo continued his public attacks, ridiculing Kepler's discovery of the elliptical planetary orbits, and dismissing as a useless fiction Kepler's idea that the gravitational force of the moon caused the tides. In both instances, of course, Galileo was wrong. In his 1632 The Dialogue Concerning Two Chief World Systems, Galileo completely ignores Kepler, the universally recognized scientific genius of his age, while calling the ancient fraud Ptolemy one of greatest minds ever to have philosophized about the structure of the universe.